Hi, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with Emily Oster. I think we'll give folks another just couple minutes to come in since we just started. We're very prompt here. 8 o'clock, we start. But I know if you're like me and a parent, prompt is sometimes a little bit challenging. So we'll give a few minutes for folks to join. But in the meantime, before we get into introductions and questions, I'll just go over a few logistics. Tonight, we're going to have a bunch of time for questions and answers after our conversation around a few just sort of key questions that I think, surround sort of all of Emily's wonderful work. And then, but if you have a question while we're chatting, please just type it into the Q&A and we'll try to either answer it then or at the end. We do not have the chat function enabled. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A so that we see it. So let's get started now that we have the logistics over and the German in me is like, there's been a minute, so I think everyone should be here by now. But I think, Emily needs very little introduction. I'm sure everyone here, like myself, is a huge fan of Emily Oster and all her amazing work. Emily has done, I think, so much for parenting and, the fields of psychology, economics, I would say sociology as well, in terms of really thinking about how to best support parents and how information overload can create anxiety and stress, even for the calmest of parents. So sort of how to mitigate some of that. And she's done so through her best-selling books, Expecting Better, Crib Sheet, and The Family Firm. And she's going to talk about, I think, towards the end, another book that's coming out. I don't know how you have time for all this, but she's also the JJE Goldman Sachs.
It's been like many years.
Oh, please, still, it's amazing the amount that you've done. I mean, you're also the Goldman Sachs University Professor of Economics and International and Public Affairs at Brown since 2015, which it's hard to believe in a way, right? Time flies. And before that, at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and also the founder and CEO of ParentData, which I'm like obsessed with, which through its newsletter and a variety of other sources provides information for parents. And I love this, people who want to be parents and anyone who likes to do their research before making a decision. Because I think that is so key.
I think we are all in that boat.
You're all in that boat, right? Totally. And your academic work, right, focuses on health economics and statistical methods, and sort of understanding why consumers, and I think this is really interesting, do not always make rational health choices. I probably fall into that category.
One of the things my research says is everyone falls into that category, and the assumption that they don't is probably not right for almost anyone.
That is good to know because, making dinner, I'm like, oh yeah, more red meat. Like, let's just pile it on.
Or butter. Put the butter in the tomato sauce. That's good. That's how
it's going to taste better. Let's face it. And really thinking about causal effects, which I think is like such a great thing that you think about, is like causal effects versus just observational data, and sort of really teasing that apart and thinking about, okay, so what do we make of these various studies that have been done, with various amounts of rigor, and how can that inform our parenting? So I'm a huge fan. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Erin O'Connor. I am a developmental psychologist. So I come at this from a similar but slightly different lens than Emily does, that of psychology. I have been a professor at NYU since 2005, which definitely ages me, where I direct the early childhood program. I'm also chief of education here at Cooper, where we try to sort of ease the stresses of parenting by, like you do, sort of providing valid and reliable information on parenting and child development through various forums, one being monthly groups that meet with an expert, others being one-on-one sessions, assemblies like today with an expert, workshops when we delve deep into a topic. So hopefully easing some of the parenting stress that's out there. But thank you so much, for just being a part of this and for all the work that you do.
Well, I'm super excited and thank you for the work you do. And I'm really looking forward to talking.
Oh, thanks. Me too. Well, I think something that, when I listen to your podcast and which not only inspires me to run, by the way, you're like a good inspiration on many levels, including like getting out there and running.
Got to get out really, really early. That's what I like.
It's impressive and it's an inspiration. But, thinking too about parenting from this angle of, I think as parents, right, we want like this like solution almost like, okay, if I do this, then my child will be happy and content and I'll be, feel good about my decisions that I make. And, sort of as researchers knowing that there's often very little research that can give us a definitive answer on like, you should do this, you shouldn't do this. And it will produce this outcome, especially around parenting and child development. But there are some topics that have been researched more and with more rigorous methods than others, right? So can you kind of walk us through an example of where there's really like a rigorous, robust amount of research on a topic in parenting that we can kind of lean into the data when we think about our decisions? And then maybe one that hasn't been researched as much, either due to just lack of data or the question.
Yeah. So let me contrast two things, which are pretty different, but I think kind of illustrate when it's easy to learn about something and when it's harder. So the first is allergen introduction, and this is on my mind because the podcast tomorrow is about this. But there's a sort of quite narrow question we could ask about sort of early parenting, which is when is the right time to introduce allergens to your kids? And there are a few common human allergens: peanuts, tree nuts, eggs, milk. There's like 8 of them. But when parents are sort of first starting to introduce solids, there's a question of, do I give that food immediately? Do I give it only later? Does it not matter? And this is a place where in the past decade, advice has really changed. And it has really changed because we have good randomized trial data. So about 10 years ago, a little less than 10 years ago, some researchers ran a trial in which they had a bunch of kids who were at high risk for allergies. They randomized half of them to be given peanuts at 4 months and half of them to be not given peanuts and have the peanuts withheld until they were a year or more. And what they found is that the peanut allergies were way more likely, like 70%, not 70 percentage points, but 70% more likely to develop in the kids where you held back the allergens. So it was just crystal clear from that data that it is a good idea to give allergens early. The thing that makes that question tractable and that makes the answer compelling is, one, the question is quite narrow. It basically is, what should you do about doing this one like food at this time? Do you do it at this time or this other time? So when you think about, I talk about sometimes framing the question, that's an easy question to frame. It's like do I do A or do I do B? And also people are happy to do either A or B. Nobody's like very invested in like caring other than preventing allergens. I don't care when my kid eats peanut puffs. It's not like ingrained in my sense of self as a parent. It's just like, I just want to know what to do. And so it's easy to get people to change their behavior. It's easy to get people in a trial. It's easy to run a trial. And so we have like good, compelling causal evidence about this narrow question. There is not that much that's like that. So when I wrote Crib Sheet, you sort of people are like, what are the important takeaways? I'm like, here's one. There's just one takeaway and everything else is pretty mushy. An example of like sort of on the distant mushy side is screen time. So the questions people have about screen time, they're not narrow. There are a million questions. When is the right time to have screens? What about what kind of screens? Is FaceTime with grandpa the same as, watching Coco Melon? Like the kid's older, should they get social media? Should they have a phone? Is it better to consume screens on the TV or consume screens in the iPad because of something about the blue light? What time should they have the screens? Like 1,000 different questions. And evidence is really hard to get because people don't really want to randomize what they're doing with their kids. And designing a study that would be large enough to pick up impacts that would be narrow enough to actually answer a specific question. Like all of this is really hard and it's new. So even like the kinds of observational data that I talk a lot about that I think is mostly pretty flawed, even that is missing because we have no idea what happens to kids when they have screens from birth, when they're 45, because I didn't have, people who are our age, like they
Not have
have
iPad.
screens. You don't know, could be anything. So I think that's kind of almost that sort of spans the range. And I think the key things that make questions easy are that they're narrow and that people are not operating other parts of their life like in a sort of very elaborate way around them. And then we need some kind of randomized or plausibly causal evidence. So I don't know, that's a big picture, I think.
So sort of thinking the big picture and then thinking of like life as a parent. I mean, I love how you put like the economic lens on things and you kind of, I don't know, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. It allows you to a little bit take a step back from the decision and sort of lay it out, maybe.
That's right. I mean, I think that like some, people accuse economists quite frequently of being like, like cold, and too analytical. And like, I mean, I see that criticism, I take that. But I do think some of these decision tools are a way to like almost set up your decisions to make them less fraught, like less like emotionally valent. Right. There's so much of what, like when we talk about choices in parenting, it's very difficult to not have your emotions be part of it because like
So hard.
there is nothing that is more important than your children. And I think we all agree with that. But sometimes it is helpful to like think about it in a little bit more of a detached way. And in my view, some of these tools, some of these analytic ideas are just a way to make it less emotional.
Well, we always talk about sort of, well, in different Cooper sessions and whatever, about sort of the lizard wizard, right? Part of your brain and the lizard brain, that's like what takes over when the emotions are just like running high and you can't access those executive functioning skills. And I like kind of, when I was looking at your framework, I was thinking, okay, this is a way to, even when sort of in my lizard brain is like, full on, to take a step back a little bit and say, okay, what do I know? What do I not know? What do I value? And then how do I make the decision?
Yeah. And I think that it's also, a lot of what I end up talking about is like, how do you work through decisions with another person? Because like the reality is like many of us are parenting with somebody else. And it is easy for those conflicts to be like just ruled by emotions. And sometimes kind of structure, like at least trying to figure out what we're arguing about, or like putting some structure on it lets us know, are we arguing about our values? Are we arguing about what we think the evidence says? Are we just like, is our gut just different? And what does that mean when we say like our gut feeling is different? Is it because this thing is more important to me than you? Or is it because we actually disagree about like whether it's damaging? And I think separating those is pretty important, because those are actually quite different things that you would be disagreeing about. And if you're just like, I think this, you're not really gonna be able to get to a solution.
So when you come to the table, let's say with a co-parent, and you're thinking about this stuff, sort of putting in economic terms a little bit, sort of how do you say, okay, these are like, this is the opportunity cost, these are like the trade-offs, like how do you approach that conversation in a way that the other person is receptive? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. So one thing is that I think we are, I think there's a couple of pieces of this. And I mean, again, this is like a little bit more your space than my space, but I think one piece of it is I often talk to people about trying to surface conflict on purpose when you are ready. So I think when we are disagreeing about things that we really care about, like a big picture things, not what to have for dinner, but like what's the right kind of school, do we want our kid to do this like very intense extracurricular, whatever it is, like when we're disagreeing about those things, if we are fighting about them in the moment, it's very hard to come to a solution. So if you know something is coming down the line, or there's a class of things that are coming down the line, surfacing a broader topic related to it, or even surfacing that future conflict, like, hey, our kid is only 5, but I noticed that like everyone else whose kid is 8 is enrolled in 12 soccer leagues. Like, can we talk about whether we are doing 12 soccer leagues? Is that going to come up later? And, people don't like to do that if they think they'll disagree, but you're going to disagree later. If you disagree, you are going to find out. And
Right.
it would be better to know at a cold state moment when you're ready to disagree than at a hot state moment when you're actually disagreeing.
I really like that. Because there's not everything, obviously, right, in parenting, but there are some things that you can kind of see, like they're coming down the road. And like, I don't know. I think I probably represent a lot of parents who are like, okay, I'll deal with that when I'm at that bridge, but when you're on that bridge, it's
Yeah.
like really heated and
I don't think you need to do it. I mean, I think that this can be taken. Like, there's a separate piece of advice, which is like, is that me? No.
Oh, no, that's me. Sorry. I was looking at the Q&A.
I think it's a separate piece of advice, which is like, don't have hypothetical arguments, which is like, we don't need to talk when our kid is 2 about like whether they're going to, how many AP classes they need to enroll. Like, that's too much. So there's a balance. There's like, like, let's look ahead a year. Like, are there things that we think are going to come up in a year? And like, how, do we want to start talking about those now rather than at the moment that they arrive at our doorstep?
Definitely. I think this kind of relates in a way. Like, I love how you address these ideas like panic headlines and sort of these clickbait, right?
Yeah.
Issues. And it's a whole part of your Instagram. Can you talk a little bit about sort of an example of a panic headline that was done in
Yeah.
such it felt legitimate, and then
So not to like belabor the screen time, but the most recent panic headline that we dealt with was a Washington Post article where the headline was like, screen time at the age of 1 causes developmental delays in 2-year-olds, or something. It was quite extreme. It had a feature that many of these headlines have, which is it's sort of very declarative. It was accompanied by a picture of a TV remote, something like that. And it, these things show up like on Instagram. It's one thing when it shows up in the newspaper, they feel like that's already terrible, but then it sort of shows up in Instagram. That's all it is. It's just a big blue box that's like, TV's proven to make your kids stupid. And it's like, at link in bio, it's like, but I don't know. I'm like, well, I don't want to visit the link in bio. That sounds terrible. And I think this is where people can very quickly, start to spiral. And I get DMs with these all the time. And they're not like, hey, I'd love to learn more about this, but they're like, I'm feeling terrible. Like, I feel terrible about this. Like, can you, like, I'd love to understand, like, have I ruined my child? I would say like every day, 3 people think they've ruined their child in my Instagram messages. And so what we try to do is like walk through those. And in almost all cases, like the vast majority, there is really nothing there. So in that particular example, what it is the researchers found that kids who watch more than 4 hours of television at the age of 1 showed different language development at 2, but not at 4. But of course, that study, first of all, that's a very extreme example, and I don't think you should have your kid watch 4 hours of television a day when they're 1, but that's not because that's just like, that's not a good use of their time. But also, even putting aside, like, do we learn something about 4 hours of television from this? No, because the families where the kids are watching 4 hours of TV are completely different than the families, the kids who aren't watching any TV. And so it's sort of like, this is such a classic correlation is not causation example where the choices that families make when they are that different and that extreme, you can't think like, oh, people just randomly chose that their kid should watch 4 hours, there's something else going on. And so a lot of what I do is try to just step people back and like make them think, oh, like actually that isn't something that people are choosing randomly, that is going to be associated with all kinds of other characteristics of the families, which themselves may be driving differences in outcomes too.
So you've taken it a step further though, right? So you have like the search function now in ParentData, you have Dewey, like,
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you're trying to sort of get parents out of this Google searching anxiety loop?
I mean, here's what I want for ParentData. My experience as a new parent involved a tremendous amount of nighttime panic Googling. And I think this is like, there's something going on. It's 3 o'clock, the baby's not sleeping, or you're sleeping too much, or your boob is leaking in a weird way, or the poop is a weird color. And that's kind of the early thing. And then as time goes on, there's just a million of these, like, my kid has hand, foot, and mouth. Like, I don't know. Or like, at some point, one of my like COO called me at 9 o'clock at night, 9:30 at night, on the way. She was like, I'm driving back from a wedding, and my mom just called, and she said, my daughter had a febrile seizure. I can't get on Google, and I need you to tell me what I need to know before I get to the doctor. And she had the frame of mind to be like, I don't want to get on Google because I know if I get on there, I'm just going to spiral. I have a half an hour till basically, I just need to know what I need to know to move forward. And what I want is ParentData to be the place that you go for that. I want people to know this is a place where I can get information that will tell me if I should panic, and also will tell me if I shouldn't panic, and will tell me, what I actually need to know about whatever is the thing that I'm worried about in pregnancy and parenting. So I'm trying to save you from the nighttime panic with some combination of an AI chatbot and a search function. So
I mean, I've gone on it. Like, this is
people like Dewey. Dewey's very, people always tell me Dewey's very nice. Dewey's
nice. Like, great name, by the way. I mean, come on.
Yeah. So it turned out actually, okay, so the name is the company name. And of course it's like the Dewey Decimal stuff. It actually turns out that Melville Dewey was a total jerk. So yeah, he was like a misogynist jerk, which is unfortunate, but the tool is called Dewey.
It works. It's still a good tool.
The tool is not a misogynist jerk. Let's put it
that way. Exactly. So I'm curious. I feel like your books have a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of followed you, like Expect You Better, Crib Sheet, Family, your kids you were pregnant, your kids got a little older, middle childhood, and now your upcoming book is about a second pregnancies. So how did that sort of come about? What was the impetus for it? What are the main sort of, if you can, give us a view?
Yeah. So the new book is about pregnancy after complications, I guess, is the sort of way I describe it. So I think we all sort of come into our first pregnancies in one way, with often, or many of us, with sort of kind of no expectations. When people come into the second pregnancy or a later pregnancy, they come in with the weight of their experience, and sometimes that experience has been great, and then the second pregnancy is probably more relaxed. But in a lot of cases, at least half, if you look at the complications we talk about in the book, at least half of cases, people are coming in with something that was, if not bad, complicated, or required management. And so the book sort of thinks about conditions that range really from, preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, preterm birth, miscarriage, stillbirth, birth trauma. So we try to sort of hit a pretty wide range. And the goal here is really to help people navigate the conversations that they will have to have with their doctor. And so when people come and ask me about these complications, the first question they always come with is it going to happen again? What's the chances it's going to happen again? And so in each of these chapters in the book, we try to answer the question, what does the data say about whether it's going to happen again? And then we try to help people think about, how am I going to talk about this and what am I going to do about it, and what are the range of options, and how can I scaffold a really productive conversation with my provider? Because the reality is, if you come into a pregnancy and you've had complications before, it is going to be really important to have a open, honest, like productive set of conversations with your provider. So when I say we in this book, actually, it's co-written with Nate Fox, Dr. Nate Fox, who's an amazing maternal fetal medicine specialist at Mount Sinai, who's absolutely fantastic. And the book is really like half me, half him. But that was a very long-winded introduction to answer your question, which was why, like, what is the purpose of this? And the answer is, like, you're right. All the other books were motivated by my own experiences. This book is motivated by questions. So this is the book that, like, I want to have for the people who write to me, not for myself.
I think it's great. I mean, and so important. So it's not out there, and it needs to be out there. So
I hope so. Yeah, I'm hoping people will find it. I'm hoping people will find it helpful.
Oh, I definitely think they will. So we have a few questions that have come in, sort of.
Yeah, let's do questions.
So let's see. I'll start from the beginning because we have quite a few that have come in. So one of them is around data around skincare and cosmetic use for prepubescent girls. They all seem to be using adult products at very young ages, often daily, and I can't find any research on potential impacts.
In general, when we look at, like, effects of skin, things that you put on topically, they mostly are not absorbed in sufficiently high doses that they would matter. I mean, this is something I know a lot from pregnancy, because this kind of question comes up all the time in pregnancy, you know, like, what if I put this on? Is it going to be absorbed? And that baby is very small, and are they going to have a sort of inappropriate dosage? And the answer is, for almost any topical thing, even things like, you know, retinol, where, like, you certainly would want to take the oral form of that. Actually, the topical form, you know, it's not recommended, but it's also, like, if people have taken it, it's not, we don't typically freak out. So, you know, is this, like, by extension, it is unlikely to be problematic from a health standpoint. I mean, I, like, as the parent of a 12-year-old, like, I did not love going into Sephora the other day and looking around for a, quote, skincare routine. Fortunately, my kid was as overwhelmed with Sephora as I was, and so we left. But, you know, I don't love the idea of kids thinking that they need to do that, but from a health standpoint, I don't think there's any reason to be concerned.
That's very helpful, because for all of us with prepubescent or pubescent girls, I think we're going through this, right? The product,
some kind of routine of some nature. I don't know.
Yes, totally. So I like this one. What do you suggest about ignoring data when you want to do something just because it feels right for your family? How can we use data when we want it and ignore it at other times?
So I love this question, because I think it illustrates so data is not your boss. Data is not, like, evidence is not bossy. It's just facts. And so in some sense, I would say you should never ignore data, but that's very different than saying that you shouldn't make a decision that would be different than what perhaps the data would suggest, right? So I often tell people, like, at least find out what the data is. And then if you say, like, that doesn't work for me, that's fine. Like, that's, you know, you can look at the data. I'm trying to think of something where, fortunately, in, like, early childhood, most of the data is pretty, you know, like, like a kind of anything is fine. But, like, let's take an example where people have strong feelings, like circumcision. So circumcision is a place where some people say, like, my gut says do it, or my gut says don't do it. And they think that those feelings can be strongly held. There is some data. The data says, you know, there are some potentially small benefits, reduction in urinary tract infections, maybe a lower risk of penile cancer, although basically nobody gets that. And then there are some small costs, which is pain, risk of infection, the sort of typical cost of a surgery. That's the data that you want, but that's not going to tell you what to do, because you need to combine that with your preferences. And I really think when people say, well, this is something that's really right for my family, really what you're saying is the preferences we have are extremely strong. And so they are likely to outweigh any particular evidence in the data. And I think that's great. it doesn't mean you're ignoring the data. It just means that you're combining the data with your preferences, and those are really strong. And so I like, yeah, I like, it's not going to boss you, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't have.
I think that's a great example. I also think maternal age can be a good example, right? Like there's that 35, oh my gosh, like,
Your
now
eggs
you're,
go, that's it, they're done. They're just with the cobwebs and everything. Yeah.
yeah. And,
Yeah. No, exactly. You could say, like, basically it's like the data does say that it gets harder to get pregnant as you get older, but it may be outweighed by the fact that what's right for your family is to wait until you're 37. And that's a completely like reasonable choice. And that doesn't, it's not ignoring, it's just
taking multiple things into consideration.
multiple things into consideration.
Yeah. Okay. So what about this one? Have you seen data about melatonin and early puberty or mood changes? What about Miralax and issues with behavior? I hear these from moms all the time, but have read so many conflicting things.
There is no, there is no good evidence that either of these links is true in the data. So the Miralax one comes up, I would say more, let's put aside melatonin for 1 second. The Miralax one comes up all the time. And the idea is like taking Miralax is somehow associated with like worse behavior. It is true, actually, probably in a correlational sense, that kids who take Miralax are more likely to have behavior problems. But that is in large part because one of the characteristics of kids with a lot of diagnosed behavioral issues, ADHD, autism, etc., are that they have trouble with constipation. And so Miralax gets prescribed for constipation. And so then you see this association, but it's not that the Miralax caused it's what we call reverse causality. So it's exactly like the behavior is causing the Miralax, not the Miralax causing the behavior. We have a lot of evidence from widespread usage that like Miralax does not cause these problems. And by the way, that it is like a really effective and important method of dealing with constipation, which is a very common problem that kids have and actually can get quite bad if you don't address it. You definitely want your kid to be pooping regularly. Pooping is important. And melatonin has a kind of similar thing. Again, like it gets prescribed more for in sort of certain circumstances. There is, as far as I can tell, having looked at the data, no evidence that it's linked with early puberty or bad behavior outcomes or anything like that. So I think this is like kind of thing that really gets bandied around in a way that is very unproductive for people.
Yes, I would agree. So this is a similar question. And that, well, it's a melatonin in toddlers, but then also, why can't toddlers take cough suppressants? The fall illnesses are awful.
Fall illnesses are awful. So yeah, melatonin. Okay, so our best evidence on the efficacy of melatonin for sleep comes from studies in kids with ADHD. So there's actually quite a lot of good evidence that kids with ADHD, like melatonin, can be an effective sleep aid. There's also a lot of good evidence it's good for jet lag. The evidence on kids who are like not in a behavioral risk group is there is less of it. And so in terms of efficacy, like we just have less evidence that that's something that works. But there are many people who say that it works, and who believe that it works, and there are reasons to think that it might work. It is something that's worth talking to your pediatrician about. I think this is an example of a time when, I mean, all the things you should talk to the doctor, but like this is an example of a time where I think there is a kind of a space for talking about, are we doing everything else? There are a lot of other sleep interventions one wants to introduce first before you think about pharmacological therapy. What was the other part? Cough suppressants. Yeah, fall illnesses are pretty bad. Generally cough suppressants don't work real well for kids. So
And why?
I don't know. I don't think they work that well for people, honestly. I don't like
for me.
I don't know. I just like, yeah, we haven't, just like give them honey.
Yeah.
Doesn't really help.
No.
I think these coughs bother adults more than kids. Like your kid's cough bothers you more than it bothers them.
It always surprises me. Like even my teenager can sleep through a really bad cough, whereas like
I'm up every time they're like, I'm like, are they
Yep.
okay?
Totally. Okay, here's another one. Okay, so can you please walk us through the process for making decisions in an unemotional way?
Yeah, so let me talk about, I talk about the sort of particular decision framework in the family farm. So let me go through that a little bit. I think the sort of overarching idea is that you should have some framework. This may be one, there may be another one, but that when you think about approaching a decision, you should actually try to do it deliberately. So the sort of first step of this is to frame a question and actually think about, like, what are the two things you're choosing between. Often when we think about big decisions, we will frame our question as like, should I do this or not? So I talked about this a lot during COVID. People will be like, should I send my kid to daycare or not? Be like, well, or not is not a childcare solution. So like, you got to have something on the other side of the ledger, right? And actually, I think in many of our decisions, there really isn't multiple choices. You really just have one choice. So if you're going to start the decision, sitting down and saying, okay, what are we really, like, unemotionally, what are we really able to choose between? So that's kind of step one. Step two is to get all the information that you need in an as unemotional a way as possible. So in most of our decisions, particularly if they're important, they're going to affect how our families function. There's going to be some logistics. Maybe there's going to be some data about it. There's going to be some consideration of how it affects the other people in the family. How it might affect our kid, whether they want to do whatever the thing is. So, get all the information, and during that phase, try very hard not to make the decision. So try very hard to just be like, this is the phase where we just get all the information and write it down in some document somewhere, and then have a phase where you're going to sit down and make a decision. And like, we're going to have a meeting, we're going to talk about all the evidence, we're going to make a decision. I am not promising that you will not have an emotional experience in this. I am sure that most of the time you will, but at a minimum, when you've gotten then to the sort of decision point, when probably there is a sort of a higher, like, emotional valence of the conversation, at least you have all the information you need, and you have structured how you're having the disagreement or how you're having the discussion, which will dials down a little bit.
I like how you talk about revisiting the decision too. Like that, so often these things seem like done, and it puts so much stress on it. But you can
I
revisit.
think there's always like there's a fourth part of this called follow-up. And I think the tension is that we revisit our decisions in some ways too frequently, and in some ways not frequently enough. So I think in these big things, it's easy to second guess ourselves, like, in the moment. So sort of tell people, like, you have a meeting, you decide, and like, then it's done. Like, for the moment, like, you're done. You implement the decision is over. But there should always be a phase where you follow up, where you think about, like, when is the time we're going to talk about whether this was the right decision, whether we want to change what we do. Because almost all the choices we make are, in some sense, if, maybe we can't exactly go back on them, but many of the choices we make are modifiable later. And it would be a shame to end up in a situation we don't like just because of, like, hysteresis.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. So this is, I like this question as the mother of a toddler/preschooler, but it seems universal that toddlers save their worst behavior for their parents. How do I convince him that even though parents' love is unconditional, they would be happier if they stayed calm? And I hear you. And through fewer tantrums like they do with their teachers or other caregivers.
I don't know. It's like the other, so I'll tell you, I know this isn't a question, but I'll just tell you, like, in my own life, my son is 8. Okay. He is in 3rd grade. He has never used a fork at the table in his whole life. Never, not one time. Okay. The other day I asked him, I was like, do you use a fork when you have lunch at school? He's like, of course. And I was like, why don't you use a fork at the table? He's like, I don't do that here. Like, what? So, I mean, I think there is a thing where our kids are, like, their behavior with us, their understanding of what they can get away with us is just totally different. Now that doesn't mean you can't choose your hill to die on. But if you actually want to modify their behavior, you need some actual behavior modification, and which is almost certainly what is happening at school, right? They understand at school there is a consequence for behavior. It involves, my guess is your kid's school is doing some kind of 1, 2, 3 triple P positive, timeout, whatever it is, they're doing something where there's like, if you do this, then there's a warning, then and then there's a consequence. If you want to implement that at home, you need to be willing to do some version of that. And some people want to do that and some people don't, and you probably don't want to do that for everything. So I think there's I don't know.
I think it's tricky, right? I mean, in a way, you want your kids to, right, do that because they feel comfortable with you. You can find out what's going on in their day sometimes when they're in these moments of meltdown. But it's extremely challenging as the parent to be the recipient of that after a long day yourself.
And what's so interesting is like it's true of toddlers, and then it's true of bigger kids, right? Yes. Yeah, it's like and it's in some sense it's the same skill. It's the same thing. Like they spend the whole day self-regulating so much out of the house, and then you gotta be like, I'm so lucky that I'm the safe space for them to like tell me that like I'm the worst, and like everything bad that has ever happened is because I didn't pack a second snack.
Totally. But at the same time, it's like sometimes like you're coming home from work and like we've self-regulated at work too, right?
Totally.
Part of you that wants to
no, it's just like, it's like, how do you be the bigger? I mean, it's tough, but it's good. I'm just saying, like this practice you're putting in with your toddler, it's going to come back and help you out later.
When you have a teenager or a preteen.
Or really anybody who is not between the dream ages of 6 and
10. Well said. So here's another question. Are there benefits in the data to not circumcising?
A lot of benefits in the data to not circumcise. So people talk about, sensation. And I think that our evidence on that is pretty weak. It's a little hard to do that trial. I think the kind of, it's probably easier to frame it as like, there are costs to doing it, which is that this is a medical procedure, like basically an unnecessary, largely unnecessary, primarily cosmetic medical procedure, that carries the same kind of small risk of infection that other things do. So that's probably the way I would put it. It's almost just like there's not a lot of reason to do it. And so it depends a little bit where your prior is about, what you want your kid's penis to look like, or cultural choices, or whatever it is.
Okay, so another one sort of related to medical question about post C-section physical activity. Guidance today from doctors feels like guidance for alcohol. Just don't do it for at least 6 weeks until a doctor clears you. Have you seen any research around the risk or benefit of introducing any forms of exercise for moms post C-section prior to the 6-week point?
So this is a hard question. The hard question to answer, because there isn't a lot of data on postpartum recovery, and there is enormous heterogeneity across people. So enormous differences across people. So I sort of we started like at the beginning of this webinar talking about like when is it easy to get evidence and when is it hard? One of the things that is really hard for evidence is when everybody's different. And so, there are a set of people who have like a planned C-section where everything went perfect, and like the next day they're able to kind of gingerly walk down the hall and the healing goes great. And like, could that person be doing some mild, like sort of physical exercise at 4 weeks? Almost certainly, yes. And then there are people who have like an emergency C-section after like 48 hours of labor and like, all fully die, like, and then is it possible that it will take sort of 12 weeks to really feel like you're able to do anything? That would be like, absolutely. And the same is true of vaginal birth. I mean, we talk about the recovery from a vaginal birth being faster than the recovery from a C-section. That's true on average, but a like super uncomplicated C-section is going to have much faster recovery than someone who had vaginal birth with a 4th degree tear, right? So there's a lot of variation. And then the way this comes out in like doctor speak, as this questioner has like suggested, is just like, well, it's 6 weeks. like as if somehow everyone at 5 weeks and 6 days is like a hot mess, and at 6 weeks, 1 day is like ready to start their marathon build. It's like that's not really the way it works. In some sense, the 6 week is just, that's like when we typically schedule an obstetrician visit. And so, I don't know. I think that like we need way more individualized discussion and individualized like seeing of doctors, of like a pelvic floor physical therapist. I'm so into pelvic floor physical therapy, Erin. I think like everyone should have pelvic floor, like you just like line that up, like have some before, have it lined up for after, like much more important. And of course, like, yeah, that's like a really important thing.
Well, I think too, you bring up such a good point that so much of this, it's like on average, right?
On average. Yeah. Like, what is it? Like, almost, it could be no one is the average, right? Like,
right.
And it's just, and particularly when you're talking about something like childbirth, which is so different for everybody, and like, is just, not, and to top it off, like there's physical readiness for whatever kind of activities we're talking about, whether they're sex or exercise or whatever it is. And then there's like emotional readiness for those things. And that also varies a lot. Some people are like dying to get out of their house and go for a run. And some people are like, I can't imagine, leaving my house with my baby, and it varies.
Yeah. I think I don't know, this is just a personal thing, but I think especially with the medical questions, it feels so hard sometimes to like move away from those like directives that you get when you're in your obstetrician's office or your GP's office, where, you feel like, and you talk about this, right? That you're given a list of like deli meats and pot, and like, okay, well, you're pregnant, you avoid both. Well, okay, probably there's variation there in terms of risk.
Less bad. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a character, and it's not really like, I think sometimes people sort of perceive what I say as like critical of medical system. I think it's not, in the sense that like figuring out how to give advice like this that works sort of works for people on average is, like you tend towards caution and you tend towards bright line rules because those are easier for people to understand. And I think that makes like a lot of sense. But it means that advice is not relevant for every individual. And, and how do we, this, I mean, in some sense, this is part of the problem we're trying to get at with the new book, which is that when people sort of face, like, even the kind of answers to questions people get, like, is this going to happen again, are often like, well, it could happen, it might not, and that's actually not super helpful. Even if the answer is like, we don't really know, the chances, like 50% or 20%, like having something that sort of can help you understand, is it elevated? Is it like 100%? Is it 10%? Those numbers are really different. And I think people benefit from that, even if there's some remaining uncertainty.
Definitely. So, I'm cognizant of our time. We only have time for a few more questions, but this, I think, has come up a lot on social media too. And that's this idea of getting the RSV vaccine while pregnant.
Yeah.
Well, what does the data tell us about this? How much data is there about this?
Yeah. So, okay. So RSV is a respiratory virus. It's basically dangerous for babies and old people. So like sort of normal, healthy adults, pregnant or not, whatever, or like, and older kids are typically not it's just a standard respiratory virus that you probably have every third year or something. But it can be quite dangerous for older adults, and it can be quite dangerous for infants. And so in the last year, they developed sort of two prevention approaches. There is a vaccine that is for older adults. That vaccine can also be given to pregnant women. It can be given sort of around the same time you get the Tdap vaccine, so like the beginning of the third trimester. And that means that the result of the vaccine is development of antibodies, which are then passed on to your infant, and then will provide protection for about 6 months. So basically through a first RSV season, which has a lot of value because then they're older the first time they get RSV and they won't get as sick. There is also an alternative, which is that there is a monoclonal antibody that infants can get directly when they are born, which would also protect them from RSV. So there's like sort of many different versions of this question. One is like, should I get either of these? And then the second is like, well, should I get, like, if I'm eligible for both of them, should I get one, like, is one better than the other? And, you know, both of these are new. There were some concerns raised with the RSV vaccine in pregnancy about preterm birth. I think that the effects were not especially large, but some people were worried about it. So I think that's an argument for waiting and getting it for your infant. It's easier to get vaccinated yourself than it is to get your baby vaccinated. So that's an argument for getting it yourself. Right now, most doctors don't have either of these. So it might be you can't get either of them. So maybe the answer is you should get the one that, if only one of these were available, I would get either. And I think it's not obvious which one to do if you have both options.
Like so many things, right? There's no definitive answer.
Yeah, and I think like it's sort of sometimes there's no definitive answer, and it's like both options suck, and you just have to pick the less bad one. These actually, both options are really good. Like both of these showed really good efficacy in protecting against a disease that like kills a lot of babies. So like it's really great that there are these two options. It's just not like one of them isn't obviously better.
So we just got a question in. Is your work based on the experiences with white women, and do you relate to women of the global majority?
So my academic research is like a lot of it is about developing countries, and so I've spent a lot of time working on issues that affect the sort of broader population of the world. I've actually did a bunch of work in graduate school about menstrual cups in South Asia. And so I think about a lot of these issues in my kind of broader professional research life. The things I talk about with respect to pregnant women and parents tend to be fairly US focused. We spend a bunch of time in the newsletter though talking about issues that or the inequalities that arise is maybe a better way to put it, across racial groups in particular in the US. That's probably the most important gradient when we think about maternal health and infant health in particular is the difference between Black women and their infants and what we see for white women. And so, this is something that I spent a lot of time with my team thinking about, how we can talk about that, how we can surface those things, how we can think about, what are the kinds of solutions that are effective. I think there are some really interesting and important ideas. Like one that comes up a lot in our work is doulas. So it turns out that like community provided doulas actually a very effective, cost-effective way to improve maternal outcomes, particularly for Black women. And so that's an example of something where I think the data really points to a kind of policy approach that we could use more broadly, that would help people of color, women, lower income women in a wider space.
So I'm always interested in thinking about like mechanisms. So with the doulas being particularly effective among populations of color, like is there research on why versus, like
I think partly so I think there is one could have speculation about why, and I think some of it relates to what we think are some of the reasons that outcomes are worse in those groups, which has to do with, in some cases, basically providers not hearing people, and so having somebody there. I mean, doula is an advocate among a variety of other things, and it's a person who's paying attention to what's going on, and so that's a kind of classic. That would be a clear reason why this would matter more for someone who was not otherwise going to be listened to.
I mean, I think that makes total sense. Even as a white woman who had a doula and who had a somewhat complicated birth, having that person who had a voice when I felt like I, for emotional reasons, did not have a voice was very helpful.
Yeah, there's a bill. Actually, you guys are in New York. I mean, there's a bill I think that passed the State House last year that requires Medicaid to cover doula care. By one of your really excellent congresswomen to push that through. And so I think that's an example of something where actually, like, if you get Medicaid to cover this, And there's a lot of reason to think that might even be a cost-effective thing to do given the reduction in C-section rates. So that's policy I think would be important.
Definitely. So I think we only have time for one more question. So what about redshirting kindergartners?
Yeah.
What does the research say about that?
So I talk about this in Family Firm. And, it's an example of something where I think that the data doesn't boss you. Data doesn't tell you what to do. But what it says is that that on average, being the youngest in the class puts kids at sort of slightly higher risk for diagnoses with ADHD in particular. And so, there's some sense in which the kind of mechanism there obvious, which is that if some of the way that teachers are reacting to kids' behavior is in comparison to their peers. And so if you're the youngest kid in the class and you have trouble sitting still, then that's going to make some of these diagnoses more likely. On the flip side, the kind of advantages of being the oldest one in the class dissipate fairly quickly. So we sort of see, other than this ADHD issue, which sort of persists, there are some literacy, test score advantages, which kind of fade out by third or fourth grade as kids get more similar. So, I'd say for a lot of people, it's not relevant, because really most of the kids who we think about redshirting are kind of summer birthdays. Most of them are going to be boys. And really the question I often, probably people want to ask is is my kid kind of emotionally ready or behaviorally ready for the sort of sitting demands of kindergarten, which going to vary depending what your kindergarten's like. So this is a very personal, this is an example of something where there's a little bit of data, but also what works for your family and what you think works for your kid is privacy. It has to be sort of take privacy.
Context matters, right?
Exactly.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for being here tonight. I know our time is sort of winding down. Can you talk a little bit more about ParentData, where folks can find you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so you can find me at parentdata.org. And there you can see all the stuff we've written, and you can subscribe to the newsletter. And you can do we search your complicated midnight parenting questions. And you can find me on Instagram, which is the other place I spend a lot of time. So it's Prof. Emily Oster.
Great. Well, thank you. And for those of you who don't know about Cooper, you can find us at your_Cooper on Instagram and yourcooper.com online. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. It's great to see you. Thank you, everybody.
Always great to see you. Bye.
Bye.